thank you for this invitation. I'm really honored and happy to be here and have enjoyed all the contributions of the panelists. And I think what I have to say will build as a segue in continuity. We face a very daunting task today if we are practicing Christians and Catholics in looking at the world around us, which sees us with so much incomprehension as people who hold to a series of moral values, ideas, absolutes, which we entitle often the natural law, but also the law of Christ, the law of charity, the teachings of the Church, which are so alien to so many of our contemporaries. And we also see that within our own families and churches and institutions, there's increasing perplexity among so many young people about the teachings of the Church, either a lack of knowledge of the givens of the Church and its patrimony, or an indifference or a downright hostility. And we are living through a dynamic of increasing secularization in Europe and in the United States. There's just no question about this. It's a statistical fact, but it's also something we all have anecdotal evidence of. It seems like the values that are so fundamental to our own contemporaries, they're not nihilistic or even completely relativistic. They're fundamentally principles of a kind of absolutization of human freedom and autonomy, a certain kind of freedom. What you might call, following a 20th century Thomist thinker, Sylvain Pinker's, a freedom of indifference. That's to say, the freedom to self-determine, that I want A or B, that I can do this or I can do that, and that civil society and higher institutions should not thwart my free capacity for self-realization, allied with a deep desire for fulfillment. So happiness is a deep principle. The desire for happiness is a deep principle of our own increasingly secular liberal culture. There's a great deal here that actually Catholicism can work with in an evangelical way, despite the great challenges that we face. Thomas Aquinas asks intriguingly in the Summa Theologiae a question very straightforwardly: can the natural law be entirely effaced from the human heart? And he says something very interesting, which is in some ways, you might say, grounds for optimism, and in other ways, grounds for sobriety. He says, it cannot be, because the human being has fundamental inclinations to the good that cannot be effaced from the human heart. Every human being, just because they're a rational animal, has a desire for three fundamental goods that are inscribed in us: an inclination to procreation and life in the family. That's to say, human beings, if you leave them to themselves, will eventually tend to have children and try to raise them compassionately, however well they do it, and in whatever configurations they do that. Secondly, a fundamental inclination to live in society and to have political institutions. He doesn't say whether they'll be healthier or better, a more or less advanced society, enlightened or unenlightened, but just that we live political lives. And thirdly, a fundamental inclination to seek the absolute truth, including the religious truth about the human condition. Now, Aquinas thinks we can get things very wrong, philosophically and religiously. We can fall into superstition, grave error, religious indifference, deep philosophical error, but we have a deep inclination in us to want the truth. And he says that is always there, so it means we have that always to work with. We always have, actually, the person's aspiration to live in family, to succeed in the familial life, which is a very deeply inscribed inclination in the human person, to live and find meaning in friendship in human society, and to contribute to larger organizations and feel accepted and feel like they're contributing. And thirdly, the fundamental desire for religious truth. Then Aquinas says, however, with regards to the way that this should be rightly realized, the human being can grow very confused and is often deeply wounded. And here's where the school of the virtues and come in to seek virtue and avoid vice, and live out what he says the 10 Commandments embody: to be a person of truthfulness, to be a person of marital fidelity and chastity, to be a person who honors and reveres God, who has a certain respect for the dignity of all other human beings, who is not callous towards human life, but is respectful of human life in all its stages. He says that this is really where the challenge comes in the human person, to recognize the fullness of the moral demands of what it means to be a free human being. and to realize our freedom in a creative project, in a good way. And only this gives us happiness that's deeply authentic. Now, the Survey Pincair's fellow I was talking about earlier calls this freedom for excellence. Yes, we have freedom of indifference. We can choose many things, but how do we form our freedom from within to achieve the excellence that will make us truly happy? I think if we approach our contemporaries with this project in mind, we have a tremendous capacity to reach out and evangelize a confused world. Because the desire for happiness is ineradicable, and it's a project that human freedom actually finds terribly difficult to realize. Often our contemporaries are actually struggling immensely to try to find authentic happiness, fulfillment, and orientation in the world. We know this very well because, as the last speaker said, we often ourselves are struggling terribly to live out our human desire for happiness. It is difficult to live an authentic, fulfilled spiritual happiness for the human person. And without grace, it's almost impossible. But with grace, it becomes possible to pursue true human happiness. And we can reach into the hearts and minds of our contemporaries and evangelize by promoting this notion of what you might call integral Christian happiness that's promulgated by the natural law, that the natural law points to, but that also we need to talk about in terms of life in Christ, grace, and the sacraments. To evangelize by talking about the peace and consolation that confession gives us, that the consolation of intimacy with Christ that the Eucharist gives us, the stability in marital life that we have through the sacrament of marriage and through the grace of fidelity, and the asceticism and struggle and cross of marital fidelity and raising children with and in life in Christ. So we have to speak to the human hearts of our contemporaries who take us to be strangers and in many ways enemies, as the friends of their own desire for happiness. And in this, the Catholic wisdom, the patrimony of Catholic wisdom is a tremendous advantage. We often feel very threatened or refused, we feel alienated, or we feel like we will be misunderstood. It's true that we have to come in with there's a difficulty prudentially of how do you approach this or that person with this or that voice in this and that circumstance. But the truth of the matter is, those who take themselves to be our enemies don't have wonderful tools to respond to the challenge of being human. We have so much more to give the human heart and the human mind as people coming out of the wisdom of the Catholic tradition. And so our first task is to know that truth and to try to live it ourselves, to try to live it together because we can't just do it on our own, and then to try to promulgate and evangelize. We now live in a new situation of fundamental responsibility for evangelization. It's not just the job of priests or lay people, just of families, just of bishops. It's everyone together. The church has to be evangelical, and evangelical in promoting the truths of the faith, the dogmas of the faith that we need to study and learn and explain, catechetically, you might say, biblically, but also the truths of natural reason, of the natural law, together. It's never enough to just do the natural law or just preach the gospel of Christ's grace. It's always together. And they're distinct. They can be distinct topics, distinct conversations, but it's an integral life, the Christian life. If we accept this burden of evangelization, of preaching the fullness of the truth of the natural law and the gospel in our own age, it's also a huge blessing to us, and it's a source of joy. And it is our task. We see it. So this gathering this morning is a great encouragement to all of us because we see that we share this common project, and our task is to move forward with Jesus and Mary. Thank you.